What's the deal with Luke and who was he? That's what we're going to talk about today. Hi, this is Jill from the Northwoods talking about Bible issues one small step at a time. I had been including an introduction to the authors and the book itself inside of the very first chapter of every book. I think we're going to switch that up and make them standalone episodes, primarily because those first episodes tended to get very long. But what do we know about Luke? Luke was a doctor. We know that. He's a writer. He traveled the area. He was a faithful friend to many of the apostles. And I think just a fantastic writer. I said that he has been my favorite writer. His writing is so warm. And chances are what he did was he went around and interviewed people so that they could give their point of view. So his books are a compilation. And so if you look at his books, Acts is the sequel to the Gospel of Luke. So they are, in theory, two letters written to a person named Theophilus, lover of God. Real person, just a generic person, or someone he had in mind. He wasn't trying to name names, but that's the idea. So Acts is book 2. It's the first sequel. I used to think Jaws was the first sequel. It's Acts. Acts is the first sequel. And Luke was never actually named in the Gospel of Luke or the book of Acts. We get his name from Paul's letter. In Colossians 4:14, Paul writes, "Our dear friend Luke, the physician." In Philemon 24, he calls Luke one of his fellow workers. And in 2 Timothy 4:11, Paul says, "Luke is with me." So we knew that he traveled along with many of the apostles. These short mentions speak hugely of him. They were at some of Paul's loneliest, most dangerous times. Luke was there. At the very end of Paul's life, Luke was there. There's actually a pretty touching show about Luke, or movie, about Luke and Paul and how they traveled together. What makes Luke so unique in the Old Testament is that what makes Luke so unique among the New Testament authors is that, first of all, he probably was not Jewish. The other apostles were Jewish. He was widely believed to be a Gentile and the only non-Jewish writer in the New Testament. Some scholars believe that in Colossians 4, Paul lists his Jewish co-workers, and Luke's name appears after that list, as to say, here are my Jewish co-workers, and then there's Luke, who's not Jewish. It's an interesting perspective, and his writing was to educate people who maybe didn't understand the Jewish traditions, who never saw Jesus in Jerusalem, but to tell them what happens and what it means for them. Remember, gospel's for everybody. And we talked, when Jesus was talking about it, that it was going to be first to the Jews and then to the entire world, and that's who he is writing for. Matthew is a deep dive in prophecy fulfillment. This was done, so this prophecy could be fulfilled. Is a Greek living in the middle of what is Asia Minor, Turkey today, going to care about Jewish tradition? As a non-Christian, when I wasn't a Christian, it was important to me, although I was Jewish, to know that Jesus didn't crop out of nowhere. This wasn't just some brand new thing that popped out. God did a different thing and switched gears. It was impressive to me that he was continuing something that was planned from the very beginning. So we get a bits of it, but it doesn't go into the details that Matthew goes into. The most expansive and detailed gospel we have, and details of the early church, was written by someone who stood outside the Jewish community, but was fully inside the Christian movement. He understood both worlds, and that made him knowledgeable. He also had a very high level of writing. His Greek writing is better than anybody else's. So he was very educated, and so he acts as a bridge for all of us, for all the cultures of the world who may not be someone who knows a great deal about the Jewish faith at all. He was a medical doctor. We gather, and the reason I think a lot of people think of it too, is he mentions, like, Jesus was sweating blood. A doctor would have known That was something that happened to people who were under a great amount of stress. But he wasn't just a doctor. He researched. He, like I said, was a beautiful writer. He writes the most beautiful gospel of them all. And like I said, he was interviewing people. And he says right away at the beginning of the Gospels, I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning. I too decided to write an orderly account for you so that you may know the certainty of the things that have been taught. These people, many of them who were not Jewish, didn't go to Jerusalem for Passover, didn't go to Jerusalem for Pentecost. They were not Jewish. They would not have traveled there. I mean, they probably knew of it. They knew what it meant. They knew of the Jewish faith, bits and pieces as an outsider, but he wants them to know what happened. And he gives the account in the gospel, the birth of John the Baptist, the angel Gabriel appearing to Mary, the parable of the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, the road to Emmaus, and other stories that are inside the gospel that are unique to him. Like I said, it's not just like Mark we believe tends to be Peter's gospel of what Peter's experience was because Mark had spent time with Peter. Matthew is going to be Matthew's experience. But Luke interviewed people, and you can catch hints here and there where he'll talk about, well, who was here, this person, this person, this person. And the reason is he's probably talking to those very people as he's writing this. He writes with the heart. There's a lot of detail and emotion that goes into his records. His parables and the stories include women. They include the poor. They include outsiders more than any other gospel. He is trying to tell everybody, you belong here. You are part of this whole world. Don't think you're excluded because you're not Jewish. And he gives voice, I think, to voiceless people who would have not fit in with, I think, the Jewish community. We're going to see when we get to Paul, there's a lot of jostling going on between the Jews and the Gentiles and those who say this and say that. This is now a marriage of people that Jesus told us we're going to be the whole world. Now we're going to have to learn how to live with each other. And I think that's something we've been doing for the last 2,000 years. And Luke is what you would call an evangelist of the Holy Spirit. In the book of Acts, Luke writes and emphasizes the Holy Spirit more than any of the other New Testament writers. To me, when I was not a Christian, I thought, the Christians made up the Holy Spirit. There was no such thing. And it turned out, whereas when we're going to go to the Old Testament in this podcast, that the Holy Spirit existed from the beginning of time. We just never called him out in Judaism. And I think we didn't call him out in Judaism because it would have lended credence to the Christians. So he writes about the Holy Spirit. He says the Spirit came at Pentecost like fire, tongues, and wind. He tells us that it sent Philip to the Ethiopian eunuch. It told Peter to go to the house of Cornelius. It led Paul across all the continents and also told him where not to go. Luke wants us to see that this Christian movement is not about human plans. It is powered by the Holy Spirit, delivered by Jesus Christ, and with the love and plans of God the Father, all three of them working together. Some people said that Acts should have been named the Acts of the Holy Spirit because they're his acts. But that idea is that he explains the Holy Spirit to us better than anyone else. And like I mentioned before, Luke was a world traveler. He joins Paul on his journeys. We can tell this because there's a famous we sections of Acts. You can tell he's traveling with him. After Paul had seen the vision, we got ready to at once leave for Macedonia. That's our clue. Luke is no longer telling a story. He's now part of the story. He's not interviewing people. He still is interviewing people, but now he's part of this. He traveled with Paul through Philippi, Ephesus, Troas, Corinth. He witnessed riots, miracles, shipwrecks, trials. He saw it all. And most of all, he stuck around. When Paul was arrested, eventually sent to Rome, Luke stayed by his side. When everyone else, it seemed to abandon Paul at the end of his life, Luke was always there. But I also know that they were wanted men, all the apostles. They were being chased down and hunted by the Roman government and a lot of the Jewish establishment. And I wonder if they were thinking, it does no good if we all go to death at the same time. Luke wasn't wanted. He wasn't a part of this. So I wonder if that somewhat gave him protection and a little bit more confidence to travel with Paul. Paul says in 2 Timothy, only Luke is with me. But like I said, I think that there are some reasons for that. And good thing too, because Luke did such a fantastic job documenting things. It's faithfulness, though, and courage in times where it could have been dangerous. Church tradition says that Luke lived a very long life and eventually died a natural death, which was pretty rare for a Christian. There are some other sources that said he died in Greece at age 84, and other sources that says he was martyred. Of course, we don't know for sure. Things to ask when we get to heaven. But what we do know is that Luke left behind 2 powerful, Spirit-filled volumes that contain the shape of our faith today, the structure of our church. I got onto a kick, I don't know, about a decade ago where I wanted to know, what was the first church like? We should all go back to the first church. I found out later that was a kind of a common thing, and everyone has a different view of what that first church is. But he tells us we can read the book of Acts and see what the very first church is. Together, the Gospel of Luke and Acts makes up over 50 chapters, spans 60 years of history, and filled with moments of joy and healing and persecution and hope and death. So Luke matters. He reminds us that you don't have to be an actual eyewitness to be a witness to other people. God uses people from the margins too. Gentiles, women, people who are not of the Jewish faith, outsiders, to do big things. And because of Luke, we see that faith is not just personal, it's global. It is about the whole world. Jesus helps tell that story of Jesus to the whole world. And through Acts, he shows us that how that story continued. Even in the prison cells, storms at sea, distant cities, the story's still going on. We're still a part of it. Hey, Luke, where are you? To get our story too. Maybe he's writing it up in heaven. So when you read the Gospel of Luke, which we did already, or now the book of Acts, which we are going to start on this Friday, imagine the man behind it, a doctor, a traveler, a friend, and a storyteller who helps us see the apostles, Jesus, and Paul in a much clearer light. I owe a big debt, I think, to Luke. Like I said, he's my favorite author that I think I've read in the New Testament and in the Old Testament too. So join me as we start taking this walk through Acts, chapter by chapter and step by step. Thanks so much for listening. I appreciate it.